Good afternoon and welcome to today's Adweek webinar, where we will be looking at the pandemic's new rules for CPG and ways for you now to find lasting loyals. We all know consumer behavior has changed so much. How do you keep their loyalty? We'll be sharing some insights on that and ways to do it with both purchase and TV data. I'm Stuart File. And today's webinar is being sponsored by Catalina. I'm Stuart File, head of Adweek's branded content studio, and I'm going to be your host for today's webinar. Before we begin, I'm just going to take a few minutes here and make sure that everyone is familiar with the features of our webinar platform and also knows what to expect from our presentation today. But even before I get to that, I just want to take a brief second here and thank everyone for joining us. It is a Monday of a holiday week, but more importantly, as we are all isolated these days, we always appreciate it when anyone and when our audiences come and join us. And I want you to know that you're not alone. You may be doing this from your bedroom, from your home office, from your dining table, but I do want you to know that you're actually part of an audience right now that is measuring in the multiple hundreds. So, again, you're part of a good crowded auditorium. And our presentation in that virtual auditorium is going to go for about 35 minutes. Afterwards, we're going to have plenty of time for audience Q&A, and we love getting those interactive questions from our audience. So if at any point during our presentation you have a question for our speakers, just simply use the question tool that you see there on the left side of your screen, and we'll get to as many of them as we can following our live presentation. It is not too late to invite your colleagues to join us today, and we'd love it if they would. About 15 minutes ago, we sent everyone a final reminder email for today's event, and in there you will find a link over to our registration page. So grab that link, send it off to your colleagues. There's still plenty of time for them to come, register, and join us live. But if they can't make it live, today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand. And we're going to send a link to that on-demand version to all of our registered guests. So keep an eye on your email. About 3:30 Eastern time today, you're going to get that link. And certainly feel free to share that link with your colleagues as well. If you are interested in getting a copy of today's slide deck, and as is the case with many of our webinars, there's a lot of information that's going to get shared today. I'm sure people are going to want to get them. You can get a PDF of the slides right now in the Event Resources tab that you see up there at the top of your screen. So feel free to go on in there and download a PDF of the slides at any point during our webinar, and certainly feel free to share those with your colleagues. Finally, I just want to urge everyone to please check out the Adweek webinar calendar, www.adweek.com/webinars. Sign up for one of our upcoming webinars. Got a full schedule coming up. Really, we're doing 3, 4, sometimes 5 webinars in a week. Lots of different topics covering all facets of brand marketing and advertising. So sign up for an upcoming webinar. You'll also get full access to our archive of on-demand webinars, which is every webinar we've done over the past 12 months. Again, adweek.com/webinars. And speaking of webinars, let's move on to today's, and let me take a moment and introduce our panelists to you from our sponsor Catalina and from Samba TV. We're very happy today to be joined by Wes Nazi. Wes is the VP of U.S. Digital Sales over at Catalina. He's got extensive sales leadership experience in CPG, agency, shopper marketing, and retail, and Wes is now tasked with delivering a new portfolio of innovative data-driven digital solutions to Catalina's customers. Wes will also be joined by Paul Flugel, who is the VP of Marketing Performance over at Catalina. Paul's a physicist who applies his know-how to personalized buying experiences. He makes sure that Catalina's marketing measurement is accurate, in context, and connected to business objectives. Excuse me, and then from Samba TV, we have Jeff Silverman, Dr. Jeffrey Silverman, who's the Director of Data Science and Analytics, where he uses big data to track all ways TV is watched today, including linear, cord cutting, gaming, We know there's so many different platforms. His PhD, by the way, it's not data science. It's in astrophysics. So a little bit of exploding stars, a little bit of dark energy, a little bit of consumer behavior, big data. So Jeff, Paul, and West, welcome. And West, let me pass this on over to you to begin our webinar.
Sounds great. Thanks, Stuart. Great job. Good afternoon to everyone. Certainly excited to share the stage today with our partner, Samba TV. I thought before we started into the slide presentation, I wanted to take just a couple of minutes to share a few comments that actually speak to Catalina's unique real-time data set, as well as the relationship that we recently formed with Samba TV. So first, as it relates to Catalina, over the past 16 months, Catalina has actually built a new portfolio of data-driven digital solutions, and it really centers around our real-time, one-to-one, deterministic point-of-sale shopper data, which actually captures all the way down to the UPC level, and that's through our direct integrations with retailers' point-of-sale systems. And to put that in perspective, we mine in excess of 2 billion daily transactions and then map that back to 440 million frequent shopper cards, or 91 million households, which equates to 820 million device IDs. So as you can see just from those stats, very granular real-time data. And it's this data that's actually paved the way for these new strategic partnerships that Catalina is engaging with, that are ultimately powering new audience personalization, measurement capabilities, certainly cross-channel, and thus our partnership with Samba TV. And we're thrilled with, we're very excited and thrilled with the partnership with Samba, in that it provides the ability to integrate shopper behavioral data and video viewership insights at massive, unprecedented scale, and allows brands a comprehensive look at how all advertising, including TV advertising, is driving lift in in-store purchases. And I think one other comment that I'd like to say about the partnership is that, for those on the phone, it gives CPG marketers and their agency partners a granular real-time analysis of campaign performance in stores at the UPC level, and allows them to assess the effectiveness of cross-device campaigns, reach customers on the right platform, and then optimize those campaigns mid-flight. And shortly, you're going to hear Jeff come on, and he's going to speak to the fact that Samba and their ability to enable linear TV optimization capabilities. So great stuff, and excited, again, to have them as a valued partner. So just a couple of bullets is I set the stage, and we really reflect on, call it the past 100+ days, is I think hopefully everybody that's on the call would agree that there's been tremendous disruption as a result of COVID, and specifically I think around the way we shop and our TV consumption habits now that we're all spending a little more time from home. And in my opinion, I think marketers, from talking to so many different brands, agency partners, that marketers have now come to grips with what I call this physical dislocation of consumers from their brands in the real world. And that consumers have been forced to try new brands regardless of their past loyalties. And certainly, I think a lot of that was due to supply chain disruptions, which early on had created massive out-of-stock issues. So that said, I think what it's done is it's produced new behaviors of moving to brands that we either hadn't bought in a long time or that we've never purchased before. And, in prepping for this, I read this, what's called Suzy study, which stated that 57% of consumers who tried a new brand now report that they're planning to stay with that new contender. And if that's true, obviously very telling. So in my opinion, what we've really witnessed over these past few months is how markets can turn on a dime, which takes me to the topic today around this concept of lasting loyals. And frankly, I think it's something that ultimately transcends COVID. I think it must be a continued focus for marketers as we emerge from this disruption in the hopes of returning to a new normal. And I'm certainly hopeful that that's by Q4. But what I believe it also does, I think it underscores the need for a greater focus on real-time data and our ability to make faster decisions as a result. So lastly, the last comment I have, and I'll pass it off, I think the reality is that there has been an evolution of consumption patterns and the underlying consumer journey. So I think whether you're a leadership brand, you're a challenger brand, you're a niche brand, it doesn't really matter. I think what does matter is your focus and understanding of the importance on real time. I think the importance of attracting and keeping what we're terming these lasting loyals in your franchise. And then certainly a need for greater accountability that will be powered by data, obviously precision targeting, and messaging that's relevant and impactful to consumers. So, without further ado, I want to hand it over to Paul and Jeff, and they're going to provide a much more in-depth analysis around these TV viewing habits and purchase behaviors. And I'm actually going to start with Paul, who will share some perspective on what the data has been telling us over these past few months. And Paul, I'll turn the slide over to you.
Thanks, Wes. As none of us are surprised by, and all of us are aware, at the beginning of COVID, kind of back during March, when shelter-in-place orders started hitting and people realized this was a big deal and lifestyle was going to change significantly, there was a huge rush to stores. We're talking about consumer packaged goods here. And the blue line here you can see is simply percent change in sales versus a year ago, and you can see it spiked during March. So all of us know that. We see that it has settled down, but it's settled down so far in the last couple of months to a higher place. So dollar sales are higher still versus a year ago in CPG. The components of that are interesting. During the panic buying, we saw that it was driven by both trips, number of trips. Initially, people were going to the store more frequently, very initially, and when they went, they were stocking up and basket size was bigger. But pretty quickly, it settled into a new pattern, which is the larger sales versus a year ago is driven by larger basket sizes, but fewer trips. So as people are social distancing, obviously people are trying to make fewer outside trips. So that's what's been going on. Now, when we look at the categories that have been driving that overall sales increase, it's pretty broad. This phenomenon is pretty broad across most categories, including categories that prior to COVID had been pretty healthy, like beer, cleaners, disinfectants. But it also included many categories that prior to COVID had not been doing that great. They had been declining slowly over the years. But during COVID, they experienced a resurgence. So you can see here we've got three of them as examples: baking, dry canned goods like soup, like canned soup or dry soup, and frozen foods. So it's pretty broad. And as I said, some declining categories had their fortunes turn, at least temporarily, and we'll see if that continues. There were actually some categories that suffered during COVID that declined. They had been fine going into COVID, and then they declined. Somewhat, perhaps humorously, some of the categories were things like cosmetics and breath freshening, things related to breath freshening, gum, because as people were not out in public, they, I think, didn't care as much about perhaps their breath and other superficial things. So that was going on. That included things like hairstyling products. However, hair coloring, on the flip side, actually increased, obviously because people were unable to go to the salon, so many people started coloring their own hair. So if we drill down to some of the factors that are driving this, what was driving the growth, what we found is that new buyers to categories were a big component of the growth. And here, for example, you can see that hair coloring during the COVID time period, 34% of their sales volume was driven by new buyers to the category. And this is really strong. If you look at a benchmark last year during the same time period, about 20% of their sales typically come from new buyers to the category during that kind of time period. And as Wes mentioned earlier, people are changing their behaviors, new buyers are coming to your category or brand, and it's an opportunity to engage those new buyers going forward and hopefully leverage that and continue some of the momentum and keep some of these new buyers. And if we look at repeat rates, even though it hasn't been that long, there's pretty healthy repeat rates that we're seeing. So that underscores there is an opportunity to, with the right communication and offering consumers the right products and messaging, to keep some of these people in your franchise. And when we look at new buyers to a category, it's not an isolated incident. It's part of a broader change in purchasing behavior and lifestyle. So, for example, canned soup, if we look at the buyers, if we drill down and look at the set of buyers that were new to canned soup, we saw other patterns. They're also starting to buy in food categories that indicate a focus on like easy prep, non-cooked meals. If you look at the group of buyers that were new to the vitamin category, they also were buying other health and beauty categories. They were new to health and beauty categories and, preventive products for illness. And for the household disinfectants, we saw similar things. So people were new to a category. If you look at their behavior, it's part of a broader behavior change, not just purchasing behavior, but lifestyle behavior. And that includes media consumption. People's, viewership has changed on TV, for example. So on that, to talk a little bit more about that, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff now, so he can talk a little bit more about people's changing behavior and TV.
Perfect. Thanks, Paul. So yeah, we took a look at the TV viewership habits of these new category buyers, so people who are purchasing these products that hadn't previously. And so one thing that we did was we looked at just sort of the top networks that these folks are watching between February and April. And so naively, you wouldn't expect too much change in TV viewership habits between February and April. If anything, maybe sports viewership ramping up a bit as baseball season starts, NBA and NHL seasons head into their playoffs. And so, as an advertiser, you wouldn't really expect to change your TV targeting strategy much during these few months. But of course, world events have changed, had a huge and abrupt change on consumption of, products and television. And so, what we did here was looking at these different networks or lists of networks in February and April. And for the statistics wonks in the room, we ran a just Spearman correlation. But for everyone else, basically, we're just measuring how similar is the order of the top networks viewed by each of these categories, category buyers between February and April. So this is on a scale basically of from 0 to 1. 1 would be that it's the exact same list of networks, and a 0 is that they're completely different. And so you see, there's a bit of a range here, but a lot of them are kind of hovering around 0.5. That the top watch networks by these new category buyers has changed pretty dramatically between February and April. And so we can start diving a bit deeper into a few of these categories just to kind of show as some examples of what's going on. So diving into the soup category, so new buyers of soup. This table is showing the average network monthly reach. So looking at different networks overall and by different genres. The composite column is the percentage change from February to April for our entire research panel projected to the entire United States. And then the target column is for these new soup buyers. And you can see, some of the genres have decreased. Unsurprisingly, news has increased a huge amount. Youth entertainment going up a bit. And so again, just sort of hammering home this idea that the types of networks, the exact networks that people are buying is changing in these few months. And in fact, that the target group, this new category buyers of soup, are changing in a different way than the US overall, as represented by the composite column. And so we can go from looking at the sort of genre of networks to the types of programs. And so again, looking at the soup category, we have a couple of different metrics here. So I'll start with the table in the top right. And so that's showing us the percentage change in the reach index. So the index of how many households are watching each of these shows that are in our soup category compared to the US overall. And you can see the top two are news programs that had huge increases in their reach index. And then the two tables in the bottom half of the slide show programs by their consumption index. So this is how much time is being spent watching these different programs and how that index is compared to the US overall. So people who are into the soup category, they're new buyers of soup, and you can see Rachel Ray, cooking maven Rachel Ray, her show is the top, show by consumption index during COVID, or what we're looking at is mid-COVID from April of this year. And so another thing to point out is that looking at those two charts on the bottom half of the slide, that 5 of the top 10 shows measured by this top consumption index are overlap, but 5 don't overlap. And so again, going from just a few month period, sort of the top consumed, the most watched shows by this new soup category buyers has changed fairly dramatically. And so we can do the same kind of analysis with the networks themselves. So we can do this at a program level. Now we can look at it at a network level. And again, looking at this consumption index of how much time is being spent on these networks relative to the US overall. We can see that there's some overlap. 7 of the top 10 networks can be found in the pre-COVID list and the mid-COVID list. But the order is different, the amount of time spent is different, the amount of time relative to the US overall is different. And so again, we're seeing, in a pretty short period of time for this category of soup buyers, new soup buyers, we're seeing some pretty significant changes in their viewership habits. And so I'll go through sort of 2 more categories of new category buyers, and we'll give you basically the same numbers, the same calculations. So looking at vitamins, so new buyers to the vitamin category, increased linear TV, again, between February and April, specifically viewing to news networks, lifestyle, youth entertainment networks, we saw increases there. Again, different than the increase in the composite overall US, and in fact, different than what we saw for the soup category. So, not all new category buyers are even the same. It depends on which type of product you're talking about. And so we can take a look at the vitamin category and their shows, what their top programs are, how that's changed with time. Again, different than what we saw for soup, but a main takeaway being that only 6 of the top 10 shows consumed by the new vitamin buyers are in both the pre-COVID and mid-COVID tables. And then we can go on and look at, for the vitamin category folks, we can look at their networks. And a decent overlap. 8 of the top 10 networks that are in this top consumed index compared to the US overall are in both tables. But again, the order is different. The number 1 pre-COVID network of Sci-Fi doesn't even crack the top 10 once we're in the middle of COVID. So again, just a different category of new product buyers, and seeing their viewership habits change pretty dramatically and in unique ways compared to the US overall and compared to even other new category buyers of different products. And the third one that we did a little bit of a deep dive into was the disinfectant category. For folks that are new to buying disinfectants, we actually saw almost all of the network genres increase from February to April. So that's pretty unique. The one type of network that we did see decrease was sports. Unsurprising, there was basically no live sports on TV in all of April. We saw, drops in sports networks across the board, every category, every group that we looked at. And again, for the disinfectant purchasers, we can go ahead and look at their program viewership. There's actually a decent amount of overlap in the pre and mid-COVID most consumed programs. 8 of the 10 top shows actually appear in both of them. So that's a little bit different than what we saw in the other 2. But then when we flip to the network level, we can see that only 5 of the top 10 networks consumed by disinfectant purchasers are in the top 10 for pre-COVID in February and mid-COVID in April. And so, maybe this group's program viewership didn't quite change as drastically, but their network viewership did. And so again, breaking it down at this granular level, being able to investigate these numbers in a very fast turnaround and at this kind of granular program, network, audience, genre level is crucially important for things when things are changing so quickly, like they have been in the last few months.
Hey, Jeff, it's Wes. Let me throw a question your way as I'm looking at the data here. So up front in the presentation, you talked about the time period, the fact that typically you may not see a big change in your TV schedule, et cetera. And park that for a second. The other thing that's noticeable to me, and I feel like I read a lot, and this concept of center of store categories, of which you could probably put vitamins, household cleaning, certainly Campbell's with red and white soup. So it looks to me that you see consumer behavior has changed dramatically, but that the numbers would suggest that the marketers and or their agency partners have, sort of kept the foot on the pedal and tried to adapt as they were going through these last 100 days. And I think a part of that would probably lend itself to the concept of reading data much more frequently, call it real time, if you will. But you think that that's a fair assessment, that a person can kind of connect that they were aggressive, pedal to the metal, center of stores. I think of Campbell's, and I'm fairly familiar with that account from my time in CPG, that historically had been a category in decline. A couple of years ago, Campbell's shuttered some of their, call it non-essential businesses, to really focus on, their bread and butter, which has been red and white. And now they're seeing, new users coming into the category. So you think it's a fair connection that, real-time data, being assertive through the last 100 days, changing the TV schedule is what's been going on as you see the success for these couple of brands?
Yeah, I think so. I think that has a lot to do with it of trying to make sure that you're getting that data as quickly as possible to figure out what you can and can't do, right? Their stuff is bought in advance as far as TV advertising. You may not be able to tweak things too much on the fly, but what you do have control over, you need that data as quick as possible and to take your next steps of where you want to go next, right? Pretty early on in this crisis, February, certainly into March, it was pretty clear that live sports was going to be basically canceled for at least a month. And, I think quickly people realized probably most of, if not all of the summer. We're seeing some of the live sports come back now, but, you've got the NBA playoffs, you had the entire Olympics move. Those are huge places that people spent, or companies and advertisers spent tons of money up front, planning, building an entire ad strategy around, we're going to be, a main sponsor of the Olympics or advertise during the NBA playoffs or the baseball season. And just that all evaporated in the span of a short number of weeks. And so being agile enough, with the data to know, okay, what can we, do to recover that? Where can we advertise to get those that same audience or a similar audience? Those are all crucial to get that data as quickly as possible and try to act on that as best as possible.
Yeah, and I think you're coming up to a slide that's going to show, how a slight allocation of budget can yield lower CPMs, et cetera. So I'll let you get to that.
That's right. Yeah. Great segue. Thank you very much. So we looked at, sort of a use case, an example, an experiment, if you will, to try and test this and see what we could do sort of in our system here. And so clearly, future marketing success requires closely watching these new buyers, these brands, and you can't assume that the new buyers today are going to look like, what they were a couple months ago or what they will in a couple of months from now, how they're consuming TV, how they're buying products, et cetera. And so to sort of test this out, we actually did this experiment. We took a vitamin brand. They had a spend of about $2.1 million on national TV ads at a household CPM of just over $22. And so for that budget, looking at the commercials, they received about 77 household GRPs, and they did pretty well against the new buyer category for vitamins, receiving 9% more GRPs for their target, so these new vitamin buyers. And so a 109 index looks good, it's not bad, but the reality is when we dug into it, there were a lot of networks that did a better job of reaching our new vitamin category. So again, these networks where they were over-indexing compared to the US overall. And a lot of those high-performing networks just weren't in the advertising plan. These were networks like Telemundo, Comedy Central, Discovery Channel. They were indexing at 120 and 130, and so significantly above kind of what the result was of the entire ad campaign. And so, and there were also, sort of the flip side. Unsurprisingly, there were networks that barely over-delivered or didn't really over-deliver to our target. And those underperforming networks made up about a quarter of the entire advertising budget. And so we did the experiment of, okay, let's keep the total budget constant. It's not add or subtract money, but let's just move it around. And so let's take some of that budget from those networks that we saw were under-indexing, under-delivering to our target audience, and move those dollars to some of these higher indexing networks, these networks where we saw these new vitamin buyers tuning in at significantly higher rates. And so by doing that experiment, we showed some pretty significant results. So first, on the left, we see that the reallocated schedule actually had a lower household CPM than the original schedule, about 14% lower. And so, who doesn't like a lower CPM? That's always a good thing. And then I'd say more importantly, as we see on the right, the reallocated schedule delivered more GRPs overall to the total universe, as well as more GRPs, about 24% more GRPs against our new vitamin buyer target. And again, all for the same budget, just by moving some money from underperforming networks to overperforming networks based off of the TV viewership habits of this target group, these new vitamin buyers. And so really having the data on the purchase behaviors, combining it with the TV viewership data in nearly real time or very quick turnaround can really give the advertisers the opportunity to identify and capitalize on these kinds of optimization opportunities. And so the last thing that I'll talk about is looking a little bit further in the future, and to do that by actually looking at the past. So, if we return to some kind of normal, if you want to make that assumption or potentially make that bet that in the fall, things will return somewhat normal, we can look sort of back. And so we looked at November of 2019, so last fall, and basically looked at, these three new buyer categories and what were those people watching on TV sort of in last November, last fall. And so here's sort of the average consumption by program genre. Certain groups are over-indexing above one, some are under-indexing below one. But you can sort of use this to say, okay, if viewership habits kind of return to normal, maybe this is where you want to place your bets. Maybe you don't believe that things are going to return to normal and you want to, try and use the more recent data to predict what's going to happen in the next few months. But I think there's, pros and cons. As a scientist, I think there's pros and cons to both of these methodologies. But again, using this historical data, either from a year ago or more recently, that can strongly inform, where your strategy should be going in the near future. And so with that, I'll pass it back to Wes to kind of wrap things up for us and give us a little bit of a summary of kind of what he thinks are the big takeaways for everybody in the audience.
That's great. Now, thanks, Jeff. Great job, and Paul as well. I'll move through this real quickly, and obviously, as I think the data suggests, right, our little transition slide of fast times calling for fast measurement, but really the concept of, oh, it's not changing for me, Stuart. Whoop, no, it's jumping. Sorry, guys. No snafu. There we go. Sorry about that. The concept of real time and the advantage that it provides, I think marketers and agency partners, and certainly having access to retailers' point of system that provides these incredible insights in 2 days versus a week or two, and certainly as we just demonstrated with markets turning on a dime, I think it's incredibly important for you all to have access to this type of capability, and I think thus which underscores where I started today. The benefit of Samba and Catalina coming together, obviously the great data that we have with the ACR, which we'll talk about in a little bit, technology that Samba brings to the table. So, some of the best practices as we think about closing this up is, I think it's going to be mission critical for, brands and their agency partners to continue a focus on investment in Q4 and beyond as you look to really retain these new shoppers. I think we've hammered home today the concept of real-time data and marketers' ability to act more quickly than ever before. I love the word nimble, and I think it's appropriate right here. And, as I just said, I think what COVID has taught all of us, it doesn't matter where you're at, advertiser, CPG, supplier, et cetera, is that markets can change on a dime. And with it, as Jeff just pointed out, the dynamics of new category buyers, their behaviors, and being able to adapt to them. And I think, what Jeff also showed was just the concept of agility that you have to have as you think about the allocation of your media budgets. and then spend within the various type of media. And I think lastly, the concept of real-time optimization capabilities and specifically optimizing around what's happening in store can yield material benefits for brands. So it's with that, Stuart, I'm going to hand it back over to you.
Great. Well, thank you, West, and thanks again to Paul and Jeff for sharing some of the data and insights here. Really interesting on understanding sort of how behaviors are shifting during these, the new abnormal. Don't know what else to call it. So listen, we're going to take some questions in just a minute here. So I want to invite the audience again, if you have a question for our speakers, just simply use the question tool that you see there on the left side of your screen. We're going to get to as many as we can over the next 10, 15 minutes or so. So please ask your questions. If we do not have time to get to yours, and we undoubtedly will have more than we have time for, I always do make sure that they get forwarded over to our sponsors. So there's always the opportunity for someone to respond to you offline. A couple quick reminders here. First off, if you are interested in getting a copy of the slides, and again, all that research that was coming in from Catalina and Samba in those slides, a lot of fine print. If you want to download the deck right now and engage with it after the webinar, you can do that. Just go to the Event Resources tab, top of your screen. You'll find a copy of the slides in there, and feel free to, again, download those, share them with your colleagues. Today's webinar also was recorded and will be available on demand. We're going to send you a link to that on-demand recording about 3:30 Eastern Time today. So keep an eye on your email then. You'll get that link. Certainly feel free to share that link to the recording with your colleagues or have them register now, and we'll send them that link directly once that recording goes live. All right, let's get to some of these questions that are coming in fast and furious, gentlemen. And Paul, let's talk a little bit here. We looked a lot about sort of the shifts that were going on in buying behavior, but can you talk a little bit about some of the demographics and how that relates to buying behavior with some of these COVID-19 category buyers? So are there shifts going on in terms of demographics that brands should be aware of and that they should start thinking about incorporating into their long-term strategy?
Yeah, sure. Yes, there are. Clearly, every category is going to be different, and every brand within a category can be different. But one of the things, for example, that we saw that was universal, that ties back to one of the things we shared in the webinar, when we saw the pattern that things have settled into increased CPG sales versus a year ago, but it was driven by an increase in basket size, but a decrease in number of trips. That pattern was pretty universal, but the degree to which that pattern was strong varied by demographics. So, for example, if you look at income, that pattern was much more pronounced the higher the income of a household, which makes sense. The higher income of a household, the more disposable income they have. They really leaned into going to the store less frequently, and when they went, they would just stock up ridiculously. So that pattern, while it was a general pattern, it varied. The degree of it varied by income. It also varied by age. So the oldest consumers did not stock up as much, and the number of trips decreased even more. So yeah, if you look at demographics, you definitely see some differences.
Are you seeing different buyers going through? I know, look, part of the shifting shopping behavior was, it became shopping, grocery in particular, became a solo sport instead of a group sport. And, again, that sort of bigger basket size. Were there different people doing the shopping? And has that had an impact?
We don't have direct evidence of that, but we have indirect evidence.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, when we say the oldest households were not shopping as much and really leaning into not making shopping trips, there's evidence based on the data we've seen that might be because other members of the household or relatives who aren't part of the household, like their kids maybe, the kids' generation, might be shopping for them. So, right.
Mm-hmm.
So we saw some of that too.
Great. Jeff, you shared all this great data as stuff was coming through. Can you talk a little bit more about Samba's approach and where this data comes from? I know we referred to, and Wes brought this up, ACR, right? And there are some platforms that are using that, in which basically it is the smart TV listening and identifying what commercials are playing on a specific TV. Can you talk a little bit more about Samba's approach and how it might be different?
Yeah, sure. Samba has proprietary technology inside of a wide range of OEM TV brands in many countries throughout the world. It is known as ACR, Automatic Content Recognition Software. So you have a new smart TV, you connect it to the internet. One of the pop-up screens at the beginning is, would you like to opt into Samba TV service? In exchange for trying to figure out what you're watching on TV, we give you recommendations and advertisements that you might actually care about, as opposed to random ads. And so we get that information from millions of TVs around the world. We connect that to basically TV channels and OTT content and video game content that we store on our end, that we capture from hundreds of networks around the world. And then we can kind of combine that information to say, okay, this TV, this household was watching, X program on some network at some time. We know the commercials that are playing during that show, whether you fast forwarded through them or not, things like that. And so by having that large footprint in the US and a few other countries, by having multiple OEM TV brand partners, we have a very broad swath of the US that's very representative of the entire US population. And then we spend a lot of time and effort adding onto that and scaling that and projecting that to the United States, to the whole population, to the US Census, to get a truly accurate representation of everyone in the country and what they're watching on TV. And so that's how we can get to this level of looking at network viewership, program level viewership, individual commercials, things like that.
Got it. Thank you. Wes and Paul, let's talk a little bit here about sort of new buyers and what's going on here, and sort of the forced trial of the start of the pandemic and sort of some of these shifting behaviors that are going on. And this was sort of an interesting question that came in, and that was, are you seeing sort of as these new buyers are coming through, are these people who might never have bought something based on their previous behavior? And the example the person gives is, people were, for example, pre-COVID, moving to a lot more eco-friendly cleaning supplies, for instance, right? There were rises in, I could go through all the names. We saw new categories coming in on the store shelves. COVID hits and everyone goes back to, Lysol and Clorox, right? About as established a brands as you can imagine. So are we seeing sort of shifts in behavior of returns? Are people looking at things a little differently? Are they things that might have guided their switches and their performances at the beginning, pre-pandemic, now sort of going by the wayside? Are you seeing any of those shifts going on?
Yeah, I'll take a shot to start. This is Paul.
Sure.
In the webinar, we were looking at new category buyers, so buyers new to a given category, like hair coloring, for example. But we've also looked within categories at a lot of buyers that are new to a brand. So as you said, in a given category, maybe someone was loyal to a brand and they typically just buy it, but maybe because it was out of stock, they couldn't buy it, so they were forced to buy another brand. So we've looked at things like the degree to which loyals of a given brand during COVID, well, they were loyal prior to COVID, and then during COVID, they ended up buying a different brand. And there was a significant amount of that going on. We've also followed those and found that some are starting to repeat on the new brand they tried. So in addition to it being important for brands to identify those buyers that tried them during COVID and keep them engaged, keep communicating with them, the flip side is also true. You've got to identify your loyal buyers who during COVID ended up trying something else, and we're seeing some of them repeat with that something else. So identifying those buyers and trying to talk to them quickly before they repeat, or even if they've repeated with the other brand once, you've got to talk to them. So yeah, we are seeing that.
Mm-hmm. So Wes, let me sort of follow up on that over to you, and that is, are you seeing anything in terms of where product discovery is occurring now, right? Beginning of the pandemic, a lot of product discovery was, you didn't have a choice, because if you wanted to buy tomato sauce, there was maybe 6 jars on the shelf, and you got what you got. You get what you get, and you don't get upset. But maybe you now ultimately like that. But are you seeing areas where discovery is taking place? Again, we're looking at very traditional areas like TV and in the store shelves. Is e-commerce playing a greater role? Are you seeing that? Are you seeing more in retail media, right, where advertisers going on large commerce sites as part of this? What are you maybe seeing in that arena?
Yeah, I think that's a good call out. It goes back to, I think, slide 4 or 5 that Paul had shared is, I think it's almost that consumers now have gotten accustomed to either going to the store, albeit a little less frequently, and having bigger shopper baskets. I think the concept of click and collect, I think of home delivery. And while that may have been not norm for a lot of households, I think the last 100+ days has now made that a necessity or a reality. I'm not sure exactly the right way to say that, but certainly I think that's come into play. It's a conversation that is usually front and center on a lot of the meetings that we have with our advertiser partners. So I think how they think about the consumer journey holistically is now much more in focus, whereas it might have been a bit emerging for some CPGs. But the reality is the planning process of making sure that you're not only thinking, even though I think the reality is, call it, a lot of the purchases, if not the majority of the purchases, are still made in the brick and mortar. But clients are definitely, the e-com has been more magnified over the course of these last 100+ days.
Great. I just want to invite our audience. We're going to go for another few minutes here. So if you do have a question for our speakers, just simply ask your question using the tool that you see there on the left side of your screen. Question here, and maybe Wes, I'll send this your way, but if others have anything to add, and that is a question coming in asking about like consumer promotions, right? We're seeing the shift in behavior. Promotions aren't maybe quite as strong as they were previously. So do you see consumer promotions sort of going away in the future, or are they going to become more important, less important? What is your crystal ball saying to you?
Yeah, I think Catalina certainly has a very unique perspective, right? Because the heritage of Catalina is with our in-store print network. So, over the course of, call it, the last 30 or 60 days, that has really, it's gone gangbusters. And I think the reality is a sign of the times, right? There's unemployment pressures, there's people are looking to save money with the uncertainty across not only the economy of how long we're going to be at home, is there going to be a resurgence? So our ability through our in-store network to offer, I'll call it, not only sense-off promotions, but promotional messaging is, you might expect, doing really well. And so I think that lends itself is, at some stage, we will get back to normal, but I think right now we're seeing a tremendous increase in that side of our business across the board, both, from an advertiser, retailers understand that consumers always want to look for savings and value. And our agency partners understand that it's a complement to the overall, flighting of their advertising and promotional programming. So I would say, it's gonna be here for a long time, and we're seeing a nice increase in that side of the business.
Mm-hmm. I think we've got time for one more quick question here, so I'm going to ask again. We're going to do a little bit of crystal ball, as somebody asked, and that is, we saw obviously all these changes going on, March, April, into May, right? We certainly saw sort of things returning, and again, Paul, you covered some of that, and when you were looking at the top with basket size and things like that. Q3, Q4 coming up, do you think that we're going to continue to see that behavior? And should that be the planning? Or, do we just need to sort of, since nothing appears to be predictable anymore, do we just need to sort of maintain that ongoing agility? So, Paul, let me start with you on that one.
Yeah, I think the answer is, well, of course, no one has a crystal ball, but I think the last thing you said, we have to maintain ongoing agility. That's the key. We have to keep our eyes on the pulse of people's buying behavior and tie it in with everything else, including their media consumption, right? Like we've talked about. What we're seeing, there was the immediate crisis and people did the panic buying, but they've settled in for the last couple months into, increased CPG purchasing driven by, of course, basket size and fewer trips. That's maintained pretty steadily, but I wouldn't say that, I know that's going to continue for the next 3 years. Like, we don't know that. It will depend. It will depend on what happens with COVID in 3 months. It will depend on what happens with some unanticipated factor or many unanticipated factors in a few months. So I think the lesson is stay connected with the data from multiple sources so you can keep your finger on the pulse of purchasing and viewing and marketing.
Mm-hmm. And Jeff, as you're looking at viewership data, are you expecting these shifts to hold? Are you expecting a return, or again, is it just flexibility in data?
I mean, yeah, absolutely. It's flexibility in the data and agility and the ability to get that data quickly and act on it if possible. A few sort of little tidbits that I can share about the TV viewership data and what we've seen in that. Unsurprisingly, I mentioned it briefly in the presentation, and we saw some evidence of that in some of the slides. That news consumption, has been a huge growth area with news programs, news networks, just seeing massive growth as sort of all the shelter in place and quarantining ramped up in March and April. But by May, we actually saw it flattening out and even decreasing, still above sort of pre-COVID levels, but it was a significant turnover we saw as either people got, overwhelmed and tired of watching the news all the time, or things started opening up and, people were moving on from that, things like that. So we were definitely seeing that. And so that was definitely not a sustained trend. It was, at most 2-3 months long. The sports viewership that I mentioned, we saw obviously huge plummets in sports network viewership. There wasn't much new sports programming or live sports on TV. And so those were low, but every little thing that was, sports related, whether it was the Michael Jordan basketball documentary, The Last Dance, or, wrestling, or, any of these sporting events that did get on TV, we were seeing massive viewership. And so as sports start to come back, as those, NASCAR having races, NBA starting its league in the near future again, I think viewers are going to flock back to that. And so that's kind of a return to normalcy, but certainly different than, if you had adjusted your spend to pull everything off of sports networks for the last couple months. I would personally, from my humble opinion, recommend, putting it back on that as these, sporting events are coming back. They're the bread and butter as far as, live linear TV viewership goes, is big live sporting events.
Yeah, just the only thing that is consistent now is inconsistency. Gentlemen, I want to thank you both, the three of you, for joining us today again. Our speakers from Catalina and Samba TV. I have just put up their contact info here, or at least if you to follow them on social. Again, it's the @Catalina and @Samba_TV as you go through this. Just some final reminders to our audience. Again, you want the slides, event resources, top of the screen. Check your email 3:30 today. We're going to send you a link to the on-demand version. and we hope you'll engage with that and share it with your colleagues. And lastly, adweek.com/webinars. Check out the webinar calendar, sign up for one of our upcoming webinars, check out the archive of On Demand as well. So again, I want to thank our speakers today and our sponsor from Catalina and our speakers from Catalina and Samba TV. I want to thank our audience for taking time out of your busy day, and we look forward to seeing everyone at an upcoming Adweek webinar.